David Blaine O'Hin ar an céad le Márta thosaí Bobby Sands a Stailc Algris sa céis fada. Idir an sin agus an mí man fórnaí deagach do héan fuair deag nar blas sa stragailt don status político sna héit blagana. Brit na prisoní sa héit blagana agus ardwatha an réaltas na Breataine. Fuair sé a ceartaí. Ag an bliain seo céim nímuid. 40 years ago, on the 1st of March 1981, Bobby Sands began his hunger strike in the H blocks of Long-Kesh. From then until October in 1981, 10 hunger strikers would give their lives in the struggle for political status. The hunger strike was the culmination of a 6-year struggle against Britain's criminalisation policy by the prisoners in the H blocks and their comrades in Armagh. Ultimately, the prisoners broke the British government and secured their rights. Tonight, 3 former blanket men, as part of Stailc 81's year of celebration and commemoration, will recount their role in the protest for political status.
My Ovid Simons here. I was sentenced to 14 years and spent over 4 years on the blanket.
Paddy McCarter here. I was sentenced to 3 years and spent over 2.5 years on the blanket.
My name is Mark Livingstone, Nalladin. Sentenced to 25 years, done 4.5 on the blanket.
I'm 90 miles from Dublin town. I'm in a H block cell. And to help you understand my plight, my story I now tell. I'm on the blanket protest. My efforts must not fail, for I'm joined by men and the women in Long-Kesh and Armagh jail. It all began one morning. I was dragged to Castlereagh. And although it was 3 years ago, it seems like yesterday. For 3 days kicked and then beaten, and then I was forced to sign confessions that convicted me of acts they knew weren't mine. Sentenced in at the Black Court, my protest soon began. I would not wear their prison gear. I am a blanket man. I'll not accept their status. I'll never be criminalized. Oh, and that's the issue in the blocks for which we'll give our lives. And over there in London town, oh, how they'd laugh and sneer if they could only make us wear their loathsome prison gear. But prisoners of war is what we are, and that we will remain. The blanket protest will not end till our status we regain. I've been beaten around the Romber room because I won't say sore. And I've been from marched down the land and then dragged back by my hair. I've suffered degradation, humility and pain. And yet the spirit does does not falter. British torture is in vain. And I've been held in scalding water as my back with dack scrubs was torn. I've been scratched and cut from head to foot and then thrown out on the floor. I've suffered mirror searches and then been probed by drunken bears. And I've heard my comrades cry and scream and utter useless prayers. Oh, but with the news that's coming in, our protest will not fail. Because now we're joined by 30 girls from Armagh's women's jail. So pay attention, Irishmen and Irish women too. Oh, and tell the Free State government that their silence will not do. Oh, and though it's only 90 miles, it feels so far away. There's more attention to our plight out in the USA. And now you've heard my story of this lonesome prison cell. Just remember, 90 miles away, I'm still in this H block hell.
So I was sentenced in January 1977, the 11th of January. And between December and January is what the British would call in courts different assizes. And so this was there was a Christmas break. So we had heard a lot of rumours about beatings. We had already been doing remand in H1. We saw some of the blanket men who had got bad beatings. So for me to go on the blanket on that day in January, it was a really cold day, and I have to say it was one of the most nervous times of my life, and I've been through it for a bit since it. It was not making excuses. I was a young lad. I was only 19, but I was brought from the reception. The screws asked me what the size of my clothes would take, and I told them I wasn't wearing any prison clothes. I said I'm going on the blanket protest, and they were laughing. It was getting no hassle at that stage. So myself and a loyalist prisoner were brought down. He got 2 years, I think it was, and I forget his name. But as soon as we went into the reception in H2, screws, there seemed to be about 20 of them in this what was referred to as a circle in the H2, and Screws said to the loyalist, "Are you such and such?" I forget his name, and he says yes. Give him a slap in the face and says, "Put those clothes on you," and he put them on right away. So all the screws were laughing at me, and I was really, really nervous at this, more nervous then. So they asked me my name, and there was I forget the name of the scumbag SO, what they call the senior officer. He came over and slapped me about, says, "Put the uniform," and I was saying I'm not putting it on. And then he told me to strip naked. So I stripped naked, stand in front of all these screws naked. And at that time I was a practicing Catholic, and I had a Celtic cross around my neck, and they told me to take it off. And because of my nerves and the cold, I couldn't even take it. So they ripped it off, and I started getting, not a bad beating, but it was enough to, I was not saying I was crying, I wasn't going to cry, but it was as close to crying as what I would have been. So one of the screws, that SO said to one of the screws, bring him down to B wing. So I went down, the whole place was dead quiet apart from the screws. We're all laughing and slapped me about, and so this screw came down, he grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, And that time, we had to get your hair cut when you're in the crumb, so my hair was short, like not a skinhead as such, maybe about a number 4. We didn't call it that then, but it would have been equivalent of a number 4. And he just grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and literally threw me in this cell. And he says, "I'll be back after the lockup, and you'll have that gear on you." So that was the start of me being on the blanket protest. And I have to say that there was a bit of relief in one sense being in the cell. I thought I was expecting a worse time in the reception, or sorry, the circle, than I actually did get. So one of the lads next door to me, when the screws left the wing, he knocked the wall. I went down there. He said to me, "Get down the pipes." We knew the way below the windows, beside the bed, there's the pipes, and you can communicate with each other. You can nearly whisper the fella next cell to you. And I says, "What do I do?" And he says, "Just wrap a blanket around you." And he says, "Now the screws will be down. They're going to give you a hard time for the next day or two, whatever." And so that did come. So for the first lot of weeks, anytime you were leaving your cell, whether you went there was no toilets in the cells, you had a piss pot, so they slop out twice a day. You had a water gallon, just put water in it. There's no books except the Bible. Then anytime you left your cell to go to even out to see a doctor, or you went for your grub in the canteen, you had to leave the cell naked. So you get used to it after. I was very shy then. Even if some of the lads who were nowhere near as shy as me, they felt shy when you're walking about in front of the screws. They're always making fun of you, humiliating you, and it wasn't funny by any shape or form. So that was me, and I felt fairly confident more the weeks went on, and then it was a big relief. I'm not just saying it, that for a couple of weeks there was nobody on the other side of me. The lads on the other side of me and a few other lads in that wing had left the blanket protest, not because I was doing their head in, just simply because it was we were all getting a really hard time from the screws. And then lo and behold, Archie Livingstone here, he ended up in the cell next to me. So
I was sentenced at 25. February 77, same thing as Chopper into the circle. I see all this talk about the protest, we had this all organised. It was sort of an ad hoc thing. Heather has said there was talk on the Crum about it. I can't even remember talking to anybody about it in the Crum. It was just like we're not wearing that gear, simple as that. There was people together. There was nobody saying, "This is what we're doing, get up there." See what Chopper just said there? We went up there and we hadn't a clue what we were doing. We didn't even know where we were going or what was happening. Same thing in the circle. Always remember his Chopper, I know his name. He wasn't an SO, he was just an ordinary screw, but he's a monster. And he called everybody square. I always remember that square, because I never heard that before. Anybody, "Alright square, get the gear off square. Get your underwear off square." And all that. I had the same, I had the rosary beads. My mum got me a pair of, it's the same thing, my mum was a Catholic. Set of Connemara rosary beads and a gold, and I ripped it off my neck. And then they went down, you were naked. And they did, as Chopper said, they did humiliate you. They walked around you and they were laughing and giggling and they were all here. It was they actually ampied the wings for us coming on, so there was a show of force by the screws. And a couple of slaps, Jack Todd, I remember slapped me, and that man had massive hands. Chopper, I'll tell you about him. But every time he slapped you, it wasn't a slap, it was a pair, it might as well have been a punch. But I remember him always sticking his card, because they put your long state sentence on your card. And they kept saying to me, "You're not getting out of here till 2001. That's the first time I thought about it. They just looked at it, they had it on the card, your sentence, and then release date, 2001, you're going to be here to 2001. I says, "That's it, so be it." But as Chopper says, it wasn't hot and heavy then. It was more sort of intimidation, psychological, and see that whole thing about being naked. None of us was used to being naked. And we were walking about that circle, there was women, board of visitors, social workers walking about that circle. We went everywhere naked, and H too. And then I'll go over to Michael here and he'll tell you about that when you come on.
Well, when I come on, it was completely different from Podrick and Marcin, because I come on in October of 1970. 1977, and at that time I went into H5, So things had really settled down. There was nearly 3 full wings, or maybe 4 full wings in H5 at that time with blanket men. Had by that time, from Paddy and Archie's time, more people had been sentenced, and most of them were going on the blanket. So when I went into H5, it was still the same humiliating thing about stripping. That was one of my biggest problems going on. Although I was scared of the beatings and I'd heard about what had happened to Archie and Padraig in H2 and the beatings that went on there after they were sentenced. So you were worried about the beatings, but one of my biggest fears was the stripping me naked, because as I say, we weren't brought up like that. It was the first time I'd ever, any other man had ever seen me naked or anything like that, and it was the humiliation of it. You were brought into the governor, stood in front of the governor, he gave you a yarn about how you were letting your family down and all the rest, but none of that had any effect on us whatsoever. We although when marching and them went on, they weren't too sure about what was going on. When we went on, we were definitely 100% sure the blanket protest was supposed to click in. I was brought down the wings. Wasn't much hassle. The H5 had really settled at that time, and things were sort of laid back, to say the least. There were still problems with food. All the other normal problems were going on in the wings, but it was pretty quiet at that time. You know. So I would go back to marching in Padraig, because H2 comes into it.
Well, just like to say about Kieran Nugent went on it 14th September 1976. He was the first man on it. And he was in H1 on his own. They actually had him in the black on his own, and they moved him from cell to cell. It was actually a time when he was taking, we weren't taking exercise. He went out the yard naked, walked around the yard naked. And the other thing about this was half of the wing facing us, half the wing facing us were ODCs, which they called ordinary decent criminals. And see, to be honest with you, they were more embarrassed than we were. Because I remember going in to get the grub out in the canteen, and every one of them put their heads down. They couldn't look at you, because you're standing there naked. It's like somebody walked in there now, naked, they'd go, what's that all about? And look the other way. And there was none of that. They didn't, the screws give us abuse. But the ordinary, I have to say, ordinary prisoners, didn't help you any. Didn't give you anything, wouldn't do anything. Someone wouldn't even tell you a time. You didn't even know what time it was. But we parked that paddock.
Yeah, but just on that, in H2, there was a young lad there from Lurgan or Portadown, and he's a Protestant fella. He wasn't a loyalist, Protestant. He would have his job on the wing, because he wore, as Archie said, he was a criminal. And we didn't use that term until years later. It was a Brit Secretary of State, Roy Mason, referred to, and now you hear people say ODCs. A lot of them weren't decent criminals, a lot of them were scum. Some of them were dead on fellas, to be fair.
Yeah, but that was an opposition to us,
I know.
ODC thing.
Yeah, I know. But this fella used to come down and clean the handles, and every day would have told us news, give us soccer results and stuff, and the odd time he would have thrown, when we were down, say, slapping out, he would have thrown a bit of chocolate, maybe a Mars bar or something in their cell, or ran in and put it on their bed pack. But one of the things that we're just talking about, this is, for me, was one of the worst, and it wasn't actually the worst beating. I never got a screw called Jack Todd. He was a real, probably now we didn't realise what paedophiles and all were, and it was all a thing, because as the two lads are saying, we were very innocent in a lot of ways, brought up as Catholics and all this sort of thing, and it didn't help people, very sheltered life, exactly. And so we were starting to get our eyes open, but this scumbag of a screw come down, open my door, and says to me, and he had a squeaky voice, and says, "McCarter, you were smoking last night?" And I was near crying as soon as the door opened. And he said, I don't smoke. I didn't smoke at this stage, because the last cigarette I had was the day I went on the blanket protest. And I knew there was a fella a couple of doors up from me. He must have been smoking, but he says, "Come over to this window, McCarter," and he grabbed me by the ear and he was pulling me about. And he says, "I was up in that tower last night or 2 nights before, and I was counting the cells down, and this is cell such and such, and you were smoking." I was going, "I don't smoke. I don't smoke." And he says, "You were smoking up at the window." And he started slapping me. I swore I was near crying. And then, because when he's slapping you, take that blanket off. And as soon as he slapped you, and you were shaking, your body was shaking. your genitals were shaking, not that it was mostly shake, but because of the cold and all that sort of thing. And he just loved it. And obviously we didn't know at the time what a paedophile was. We'd heard the term paedophile, but when we all got together in H5 and talked about H2, but just before we go back to H5 again, and just to say about the only time we wore any part of uniform was going to Mass on a Sunday. And most of us were practicing Catholics at that stage. So you would have wore the prison trousers. The cell, the chair you had, it was a plastic chair in your cell. You would have carried that to the other wing where the Mass had been said, and you couldn't have looked at each other. See if you even looked at each other, you know, or nodded. See if I had tried to note. The Archie was next door to me anyway, but some of the lads, like I remember when Benny Lynch and Jerry McConnell, two Lennox lads, they come on, they were on another wing, and then Marty Lynch, Dr. Lynch, he came on the R wing, and he got a bad beating. So Benny hadn't seen him in months, because none of us were taking visits. And Benny went down, at the Mass we were all sitting spread out. They could talk this term now, they call it social distancing. We were spread out, and Benny nodded over to the doctor, and the screw in front of the priest, and this priest was, this is another, there's this myth about somebody, this priest was a scumbag, put his head down, turned around, and did one of those. The screw came over, big slap in the face with Benny, and we were all, there's nothing we could do. You know, if we had even said anything or tried to jump, and none of this thing about why didn't you jump up and hit him or whatever, you literally put the head down. The fear that they instilled within us.
Farewell to Balahi. Likewise Tom the Dove and the green hills of Derry, what I dearly love. And my thoughts return to you from me dark age black cell. So friends and brave comrades, I bid you farewell. Through the hills of South Derry, how we marched and we drilled, and our exploits and actions, all Irish you thrill. The most feared men in Ulster, volunteers on the run, we gave England our answer from the barrels of our guns. Farewell to Balahi, and likewise Tom the Dove and the green hills of Derry, what I dearly love. And my thoughts return to you from me dark age black cell. So friends and brave comrades, I bid you farewell. O gallant Sir Derry, be forever blessed in the struggle for freedom. You've given your best. Well, there's Hughes and there's Bateson, Sheridan and Lee, and inscribed with their names now, old Tom Agilwee. So farewell to Balahi, and likewise Tom the Dove and the green hills of Derry, oh, that I dearly love. And my thoughts return to you from me dark age black cell. So friends and brave comrades, I bid you farewell.
I was only out 6 months. I was back in again. I was in town for 2.5 years.
What age?
16. And was 19 when I went into Crum. So I actually made, it was the first OCA wing route status, which is hard. But going up into the blacks, it's political. Doubt about it. Then people say, what was your 5 demands? We're not criminals, basically. And here, whatever way...
The demands weren't made then? The 5
no,
demands?
No, there you go. There was no demands. We knew it was a war. We knew this was... They broke us, they're going to break a struggle. Simple as that. And anybody says... You can go through all these demands. We talked about this morning. You can go through them demands. We know every one of them demands is put. But see, on the face of it, see, the first time they ever called it political status, they called it special category status. Never admitted that we were political prisoners. It says we were special. Went through special courts, we were interrogated specially, we got special sentences, you know what I mean? But we're special, that's the way they looked at it, and that's the way we looked at ourselves. We were political prisoners, and here, and we weren't criminalising the struggle for anybody, simple as that.
So overnight their policy was that the British at that time, their policy was to criminalise and normalise the North, and the prisons were a massive part of that. And when, even before Thatcher came along, they seen the prisons as the knacker's yard for the IRA. They seen that as the place where they were going to break the IRA. They believed that they could break the spirits of the prisoners at that time. And when Heather went on that, as we all know, the history of Heather being the first blanket man, it was that was the first indication that we weren't going to take it. The political prisoners were not going to turn around and say they were criminals, that they were no matter what was going down. And as I say, and Heather was the first one to make that statement, and we seem to have followed after. Hundreds of men who had been sentenced, who had been like Archie and others, who had been in the cages prior to this, and who had the freedom of education, the freedom of wearing their own clothes, the freedom of their own identity. Not only were they now being sentenced, they had that taken away from them as well. And in doing so, they believed that they were taking a dignity and everything away from them men went on, especially the men who had been in cages beforehand, because they understood it more than the like of myself, who went straight in, lucky enough, into H5, whereas Archie and Emmons were going into H2, were the Batons. Now, we had heard about the Batons, we were scared of the Batons, but Paddy and Emmons done at a different time, was sort of settled a wee bit. And as I said that before, but when we went into H5, things started to change, you know, after a couple of months, you know.
Just getting back to us moving to H5, and the reason for us moving to H5 was because more men were being sentenced. Unfortunately, some men couldn't stick the protest, and we had no issue with men who tried it because it was very difficult for us all. We all knew that, of course. But in April of 1977, we were all moved to H5, and it was like we were like kids at Christmas. 2 days sale. No, sorry, at that stage it was 1 day of sale, and we were all going, can we shout out this? Can we actually shout at each other? So we ended up shouting across the wing. The atmosphere changed right away. We got a wee bit more food because in H2 we literally dreamt the food. You literally dreamt the food. We're all, when you're young, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, even life out here, that age, you're always very hungry, and your body's growing and all that sort of business. But when we went to H5, our morale rose, and we were convinced in April of 1977 that we were going to get political status very, very soon, simply because of the numbers that were coming on the protest. Women in Armagh were talking about going on protest as well. They were on protest, but it didn't escalate as much as it did later on during the no-wise protest, but we'll talk about it as we go on. So morale was very high. The screws had stopped the beatings. We were getting out. We were able to go out for a shower. We were able to wear a towel. And not that the screws got any friendlier, by the way, but they were less antagonistic. The humiliation, because they realised the way in which they humiliate you was to break you right away, get you down in the whatever H2. There was lads who were over 21, they were in H1, and the same thing was happening to them. And then having with the criminals on the other side, as if we were going, they're wearing a uniform, they were getting slapped about and all too. Obviously not as bad as us, but H5 was a big turning point for all of us, morale-wise.
when I went into H5, as I say, things were pretty laid back. But there was, I went into what you would call then an Oldhands wing, whereas most of the people in the wing had either been in jail before or were well over 21. And the wing opposite me, that was A wing. The wing beside us was B wing, and that was a YP wing. That was the wing Archie was on. But every Sunday at Mass, you would have heard something about the YP wing. The screws would have been giving the YPs a hard time. Where I was going to slopping out, going to Mass that day with their food, throwing their food on the floors. We're constantly giving the YPs, although it was quiet in our wing, we're constantly giving the YPs in that wing a hard time. And just sort of, while I was in the wing, before I was in the Oldhands wing, they moved me and a couple of others into Archie's wing, which was B wing. Before that, in that wing, in A wing, I'd met John Nixon. There was a couple of hunger strikers in that wing. Tom McAwee was on it, Mickey Devane was on it, Michael Devane was on it. And I'd like to say a couple of things about that later on. But when they moved, it so happened that one Sunday, this was happening every Sunday, the YP wing were coming to Mass and they had their complaints and they were going to the staff and telling the staff what had happened, and the screws were coming and abusing them, throwing stuff around their cells. And eventually on one Sunday when the YPs were at Mass, the screws went into the cell, ripped their cells apart, anything that they had in it. That was the first day disinfectant. Started throwing disinfectant around the cells. So when we got back into the cells, you couldn't open your eyes. They also smashed windows. As well, racked beds, and then proceeded to blame the prisoners on doing it themselves and charging some of them with it. So that sort of was the first wee thing. Now behind that, Brenton Hughes and Bobby and the rest of the staff at that time were discussing ways to advance the protest, not to escalate it. There was different things, with different ideas that come up at that time. There was a three-pronged suggestion put forward, but the thing with the blanket men was they weren't going off the blanket. Regardless, I don't think anybody could have took them off the blanket at that time because the blanket men had it in their mains. But once that started in that wing, the aggression, that wing was moved to H4, and on the way to H4 it wasn't too bad. There was a few beatings, but the minute we put our foot into H4, we knew what we were in for. The aggression, the difference in the screws, everything had changed, and that was our move, and that was because of the move, moving the YPs from B wing H5 to H4, because they thought that the YP wing was the weak link. They thought they could have brought them. So we were the only block in H4 at that time, but we knew the minute we walked through the door, the aggression, everything else, the attitude, the screws.
People have this idea that there's a hierarchical structure in the jail with the governors and the number 1 governor, number 2 governor, number 3 governor. Me moved in before the POA run the block. Sorry? Prison Officers Association, screws. The ordinary prisoners are screws, and they run it, especially Brian Armour. Brian Armour, people used to say he wasn't even an SO. He's an ordinary screw. He told the governors, the chiefs, POs, SOs, come down the wing, he run the block. He was, I don't know what he was then, he was something in the POA, but he could become, what was he, chairman or something at the end of it. But he run that block, and he told them, because I remember the first time I seen him, it was a red house screw. They have the red on their epaulets. That's how you know they're red. It's only starting, only getting trained. And he was standing, they were handing me 2 plates of grub in. And the screw was standing, and he had a salt cellar. And he wanted to put salt. Do you want salt on your dinner? And he knocked it out of his hand. He says, "Don't be pampering them bastards." And I looked at him. It's a red rat. They could call the horse at the start. There's a red rat at the end of it. And I knew this boy's going to be trouble. And you'll find out as you go along. This boy run the H4.
Well, see, just getting back to how the protest escalated, because I remember I was still in H5. I'd moved over from the wing I was on with Archie over to C wing, and I ended up in the cell with Paul McClinchy. And the cells at this stage, there were bunk beds. There were a small cell. There was a bunk bed, obviously a bed each. We had sheets, blankets, pillow, piss pot just in the cell, a water gallon each, piss pot each and a water gallon each, and a wooden table, and a chair. I was fairly comfortable and all this sort of thing, and we were starting to get the only other reading material we got from the Bible, apart from the Bible, was religious periodicals, and that's when I personally started to question. Even before this, I started to question the whole thing about Christianity, Catholicism. I started to read these fairy stories to me. Now I understand there was a lot of lads who still believed it in saints and the miracles and all that sort of. But we used to have debates out the door. A lot of us were learning. Most of us were learning Irish. We were learning songs, poetry, and morale was, as I said earlier, morale was very high. So this particular day in March 1978, I ended up having words with a screw. I was down slapping out, and we had came a bit of a scuffle. There was no, it didn't think. So I ended up on the boards, and I remember when I was down on the boards. This is you were in solitary confinement, and I got observed for 1 day. Then I got 3 days, what they called 3 days number 1 diet, where you just had a bowl of soup. Or sorry, in the morning you got black tea, 3 or 4 rounds of palm bread, no butter or margarine, dry bread. For your dinner you got a bowl of soup with potato. You're lucky getting a potato in it, watery soup. It was alright, it was edible. And then that night you got a cup of tea and 3 rounds of bread.
Black tea?
That's black tea. And I was hot and you know, whatever. So I was it. But that was just by pure coincidence, the number 1 diet. It was again in British law, and obviously because we were in the 6 counties, it still come under what they call British law. It was changed about that time. But when I come back onto the cell, and McGlinchey was saying to me, it was I can't remember, it was Friday or Saturday, and there was a bit of a buzz and says we're going to start a no-wise protest on Monday. And I mean Monday, and whatever. So then on Monday, and the reason for that being was, as I remember that when the first time I saw the dark, because we would have seen lads like St Bobby Sands, Joe McDonald, other hunger strikers at Mass and Sundays, and you weren't putting people on pedestals, but we're all young lads, you would have seen. But when the Brenton Hughes, he had a big name, we had all heard of him before we'd even met him, and then when he came onto our block, and the term it was the first time I ever heard that term, we're on a pig's back. One of the lads came back, and Sid Welch was the OC of the wing, and that night, right with a column here to read out from the dark, and it was the reason why we were going on the protest, and it finished off, and we were on a pig's back. We were banging at doors, and we was going, "What's on a pig's back mean?" You know, all these terminologies. All our lads' language would have used, but we didn't. So that became like we're on a pig's back, and so even though we knew what was ahead of us, for all that. We just knew we can't sit the way we're doing here. We're going to be here forever and a day. Archie was doing 25 years. I was lucky. I was only doing 3. Micheál was doing 14. Paul McGlinchey, I was in the cell, was doing 15 years. Some men in the wing were doing life. And we thought at that stage, life meant life. 25 years.
Well,
Archie was going to be there, possibly the 2001. We were under no illusion about this here. And not that I felt guilty. I was going, like, I'm only doing 3 years. A couple of our lads in the wing were doing 3 years, 5 years. So it was relatively easy. The jail itself wasn't easy, but psychologically it was a lot easier for me.
What Paddy was saying, about, to get back on it before we go back now to the escalation of protest, but the reasons why we were forced into it again was in that B wing in H1, they must have been on at least 3 or 4 different times. The whole wing was on a number 1 diet. That was the whole wing, had no food, and the nights they came round, they were throwing their food on the ground. So then they were coming around, the screws were throwing their food on the ground, then coming around and charging the people in the cells for throwing the food on the ground, and then putting the whole wing. So that whole wing, and again, was on a number 1 diet. That was before it was moved. So 3 or 4 times even before it moved from H5, which I say was relatively calm, to say the least of it, you know.
Yeah, I actually mentioned when they shot Ulster Albert Miles, they mentioned the number 1 diet, said that was inhuman, and it was inhuman. He was a governor shot dead by IRA.
But
the number 1 dad was knocked in the head just shortly after that. It was him give us it. But he used to walk up the yard giving you it. That's the way. This is number 1 governor. He used to walk up the yard giving you his fingers.
Now we had moved to. This is getting into early 1978. Getting into H4, and you know. It was, at the start, as I say, screws were aggressive right away. Aggressive, automatically, anybody slapping out, there was always somebody was beating the wing. Anybody went out to the MO. Now when I say beating the wing, this was just 1 or 2. you know, at the start. People going to a doctor, going on visits. Dairy men were going on their visits. They were asked where they were from. If they didn't say it the way they wanted to say it, if they said anything other than, if they said dairy, that was it. They didn't get their visits. They said they didn't know where dairy was. Wee things like that, wee niggly things the screws were at. As much they were beating us, but not as bad as was to come. We were picking on guys going on visits. I ended up in the cell when I went to B Wing H5 where Tom Margaway for a while, and it's some great memories of that. But as we moved to when we moved to H4, Tom was moved out of the cell. He moved into the same wing, but was moved out of the cell. But he was one of the first ones to go on the appeal visits. Him and I'm near sure a guy called Dixie Elliott. And I'm not sure why Dixie was on the appeal visits, but he was on visits anyway at that time. And the beatings that they took in cell 26, that's when it really started, were Tom and Dixie and several other prisoners who were on appeal visits, but they were the first two. So every time they went out on appeal visits, they were getting beat on the visits, going out, getting beat coming back, and getting beat in the cell. And that was constant. That was constant every day. That was every day Tom was called for a visit, because somebody would have been there from up in the country or up in Belfast to see him. And so it was actually, the screws were escalating their protests rather than us. We had our own plans, we knew where we were going with it, but they were escalating their protests, pushing us as much as they could back into our cells, making sure we weren't on the wing at any time. Any opportunity that they got on the wing. And just early on in 4, one of the things they started to do too was the scalding hot water. There was nobody using the hot water that was pumping into a black. So they were going down and taking bucketfuls of hot water, the steel buckets that you'd see years ago, and they were taking them down and throwing them into cells around people, scalding them. Later on, when the Kilwheel men come in, that was Kilkeel. When the Kilkeel men come in, there was a squad of them was caught together, and I can still remember to this day them roasting them. And the first thing they done when they got them into the cells was they snuck down with the buckets of water, opened the cells, and threw it around them. You used to be able to jump to one side, maybe misty splashes hit you, but people were roasted. But so these were the wee things that the screws, well, weren't we, but the screws were doing to escalate their protest.
Used to do it over lockups. We'd be lying on the beds.
To break us, to eventually keep us in our cell, which they ended up doing in H4, and then after that it started to become systematic.
You also started searches, bringing you on the wing to search you. This isn't an excuse to get beaten you. See, when Mickey was talking there, by the way, they were using the numbers. Same way we were out in our visits, you give your number, you didn't get your visit. But when you come back, you didn't give the number. And you used to stand with your book and stick it in your face. And you say, there's your number, what's your number? I haven't got a number. And some of the, know what their favourite one was there, and they'll tell you, but we all got it, like. The worst steel toe cap boots, kick the shins off you. So when you come back, see your shins from there to your toes, blood running down your legs. And if you ever get kicked the shins with somebody with a pair of steel toe cappers, it's sore.
Yeah, but see leading up to the no wash protest, and as Micheál was saying about the screws throwing piss out. So what we decided then to do, that the screws were coming around and with the orderlies with a big plastic bin, and they were saying, right, pour your slaps into the bin. So you're talking about 50 men, 46 men on each wing, and you can imagine how much piss you were pissing, because you're drinking a lot of water and stuff. And this is coming up the winter. This is the summer at this stage, and so we then were told to not slap out until that night, and if the screws come around with a bucket, just say you were pouring it out the window. And it was myself, I was in cell with Paul McClinchy. This particular day the screws came around with an orderly, and this orderly was a scum. He was as bad as the screws. And the screws said, I was up in the pipes letting on to pour it was lovely, so it was June or July 78, lovely summer's day, but we didn't get any benefit from the sun because we were up in our cells, as I said. And the screws said to me, right, McCutter, throw it in the bin here. And I says, I'm throwing out the window. I let it on to pour out the window. The screws, you're not pouring that out the window. And I says, I am. So this orderly was standing with a steel bucket and the big bin. So one of the screws came in the wing to grab me, and Paul McClinchy took the piss. I was up in the pipes. He took the piss pad off me and threw it around the legs of the screws. So the screws come in. We got into a scuffle with the screws. We ended up with a screws hat, a tie, and a whistle. And the screws. This orderly was coming in, and he made a swipe with a metal bucket and just missed us. And the screws had the buttons out. So it was a bit of a thing. We ended up bloody noses and cut toes and all that, as Archie was saying. We didn't get a bad beating. So the next thing was that our nerves, we were dead nervous. We were letting on to be dead cocky, blowing the whistle out the door and all. And next thing the screws, alarm and all went. We went down, screws told us, right, we're going to the boards. We knew we were going to get such a beating. But there's a PO then, and as far as screws go, he wasn't the worst. A PO called Lappin. He came down and he said the screws in front of us, these men aren't to be touched. Screws are going bananas, as Archie said. In a lot of ways the POA ran the wing, but then there's other times that governors and screws come in and says, this isn't happening. Now, once in a blue moon this happened. So I ended up on the boards again, got a bit of a shoe on the boards, but then later, about a couple of hours later, we heard all this screaming. It was Benny Lynch and Jerry McCampbell. They thought we'd done this as part of a plan for us to throw piss around the screws. As soon as they come around and slap out again, they threw the piss around. Only they got the four times as much as we got. But Jerry McCampbell got that bad a beating. He ended up in the hospital, prison hospital, whatever. So that ended up the protest again when we smashed our windows, and we were relieved to smash our windows, especially in the summer, letting air in because of the disinfectant. So
there's blue stuff in it. You couldn't breathe it.
So that was in, and then coming into the winter of '78.
All right.
Windows and all out, and you're talking about this was the coldest winter in history.
Ramar mar hasan the kidney. It's casual go gornian shit hard ord. Chick shit to reshoe in the front seta. On near real. Jig shit to waru the gilling hates blah. Do go door he grimlad. Oh, he'll not near it the spirit of reached. Be shade a creek and the slan of arch. Agus ag foiil bwaist ag struck tún a slurry. As canar an the sir seo sar. A tam o creebris jog is pain last ye go for. Ta shed and sure far. Kegar emi to a wad o han. Tamage nis ladder an nish. Hashpen to doing though in the sear show and Jamal. While on the mail by la forest la foy, start a collage and the shoe cream. Agus kent and Nacnerian a bally for a star. Ta she fag a reach as a reach dog on. My glad shot sig mohi maran to in ye. Were shing yard to Lanston right. O galasi the spirit and the wala. August chalky aragan a tamo creebris jogus pin last ye for the shit and shore fad kegaremi to a wado hem. Tamage nis ledra nash. Haispan to doing and though in the sear show and your
They'd done a couple of wing shifts and searches and stuff like that, and this is before the mirror was brought into being, and what they were searching over was a table like something like that in front
For
of
make
you
a
there,
table.
where you went onto the wing that you were getting into, and they threw you over this table. When throwing you over this table, men were black and blue for weeks after. They were cutting the table ends, was cutting into your thing.
There's forearm, arms and legs.
They were holding your arms and legs, both for one holding each arm, one holding each leg, and
Like a
spread
chicken.
apart. And even at that time and times to come, what they were doing was some of the screws wore gloves, some of them didn't give a shit about the gloves, and what they used was their fingers on your personals, and then when they searched the next person that came in, they searched his mouth with the same finger that they used on the personals, and I've seen that myself on several occasions and on several wing shifts. But that was before the Murray came in. Again, this is the screws escalating their protest, the government outside, everything else to break us. And the cell searches started steaming, throwing steam in hot water, starving us, beating us. And that was constantly going on. Our visitors were being attacked coming up. On Gorman at one time was actually attacked with dogs. Let the dog police owners shoot a few times, and other members of our families were tortured for years coming up on a visit. And so obviously we had to escalate. We had to go somewhere with it. And there was men sitting down in corners at Mass on Sunday, people in the wings, all discussing where we should come here, and or where we should go with this. And as well, you know, the decision was made eventually to go on hunger strike. This was not just out of the blue. This was after the dark had went to H3, because the dark was in 5, and he had seen it was quiet enough in 5. The dark had went to H3 and seen what was going on in H3, and found it hard to take, because the men were being beat. Something happened in H was very bad in H3, the same in H4. Scaldings, beatings, on visits, as it says, coming back from visits. Every time you stepped out of that cell, they actually started coming, even doing wee raids at night. After lockup, which they'd never done before, which was pretty terrifying, because that from they locked up to they came back in the morning was our time to socialise, was our time
We were relaxed.
to light up the place. We told our stories. Paddy said there were sing-songs, our lectures, our gilly classes, quizzes. Unbelievable the system we had to keep ourselves sane. Simply keep ourselves sane from going insane. The talent we had on the blocks for storytelling, the talent we had, singers we had them all, right down to trumpet players, you name it. We'd that right through. But this was constantly going on. These beatings were constantly going on. People coming back from visits, and some of them were ridiculous. After O'Fee came into the jail, they brought us in.
Black hole at
They
Calcutta.
give us chairs. You know about the statements O'Fee made when he got out. They give us chairs and they give us magazines or something else like that.
Religious magazines.
And that night we decided, because they'd come around already and started raiding cells, that night we decided to smash the chairs. It wasn't much we had in the cell. We had the chairs, but they put these metal grills to stop us swinging to each other and making contact out the windows. We put them all around the windows, and we were able to take them off. I'm near sure we were in H3 at this time, but that night alone, there was 145 people beat in the block. I can remember the wing. I remember the person who was a shouter. When I was Archie, was a shouter, and at that time shouting it over the R block. Then we came in that night, and they went to the first 2 wings across from us, and by the time they got to our wing, they got to the first cell. They went into the first cell. It was an odd PO or chief who was on that night. We'd never seen him before. The screws were actually, they weren't blanket screws. We'd never seen these before. It was some sort of special squad that sent in. I was a rad squad on that. And when they came into the wing that night, the first cell they went into in our wing was a guy called Don McGuinness and Joe Boner in it. One was from South Armagh, and the other one was
Charles
from,
Raymond McCreesh.
the other one was Don was charged with Raymond, and the other one was from Strabane. And when they went into their cells, the minute they left their cells, the boys got up and Don shouted over to the OC of the wing, "Tashid Igbuli or Udini, August Tashid Curry Keston Orin, Ian Akar and Gwynna and Bala." They were asking the prisoners when they went into the cell to face the wall so that they could search the cells. And as they went into, well, the prisoners refused right away to face the walls, and they went round every single cell and they beat every man in that wing that night. They beat some really bad. Anthony McIntyre was one of them. He took an awful bad beating that night. Other prisoners in the wing were beat that night. They beat a guy in a cell, and when they beat him down into the pipes, and when his hands were crossed and he was against the pipes being roasted, it must have been the summer because they very rarely put the pipes on. They beat him nearly a pulp because his hands were joined because they thought he was praying. He was actually an atheist, and it's just the way he was forced into the corner, and they beat the crap clean out of him. They kicked him round the cells that night, and that was a big one that night after O'Fake done, because there were so many in the wing beat that night. But that was a constant thing. Every wing shift, you were talking about at least 20 to 30 men getting beat. Some maybe out of that 30 men, there was 5 or 6 beat badly that had to lie in cells, groaning and moaning because of the pain they were in, you know, and we weren't getting out the MOs or doctors to see anything, because you went out to a doctor to do a body chart, they beat you again, and they beat you on the way in. And that was a thing was leading. That was one of the things.
It's also
again,
the
leading up to the hunger strike.
The forced baths. Those people were stinking, like their hair was long, beards. So they had this thing of going to come in forced baths and shave us. And they brought everybody in, they brought bin lorry drivers, from every square in all them fucking mechanical screws, sorry per cursing. All them mechanical screws, the ones that have done the maintenance work, they brought all them in. And I came back from a visit, I was walking up a yard, and they were all shouting at me, and next thing I heard, "Oh goody goody, Livingstone's not done yet." It was Brian Armour. He was evil. He was standing rubbing his hands, going like that, "Oh goody goody, Livingstone's not done yet." But this is just me personally, I can talk about what they got in the paper.
Yep.
They held you down the chair and punched the face, and then they shaved you. And see, the guy was shaving me, his hand was covered in blood. And I run around, when they run me around the corner, John Connolly was standing around the corner, and his eye was busted, my nose was busted, and the two of us busted out laughing, because that's all you could do.
Yeah, just before that, I mean, H5, obviously, when Bobby Sands, he was doing OC, the Dark was doing OC, lads from H3 and H4, on a clear night, you could shout out very clearly what was happening. It was all done as Stailc. And bad and all, we were getting a bad too in H5, by the way. It wasn't just H3 and H4, by the way. It wasn't just as bad as those other blocks. And we've always wondered, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, we talked about this when I'm back in the jail 4 years later, and we talked about, we didn't dwell on it, but we spoke about why didn't we get as bad a time as H3 and H4 got. And it was deliberate on our part. The screws were hoping to break, if they broke one block, as in H3 or H4, then they'd come up and think. Now we did get a hard time too. There was forced washes of them as well. But the first 2 people in our block to get it was Jerry McConville from down the road and Pat Livingstone. They were forced bathed. And for most of us, all young lads, me personally, all I had was a bit of moustache and a bit of bum fluff on my chin. So, and a lot of us in our wing didn't even, very few of us shaved. So the screws would have come round with a doctor every so often, not every week, or maybe once every 4 or 5 weeks, would have come round and say, look, the doctor looked at who was ever in the cell. And some lads, because they maybe had to shave, maybe the big heavy beards, longer hair, and they're dirtier looking. They were forced washed. So we just before we get on to the hunger strike, and this is just my final point about it. And I was as the protest escalated by the screws, the beatings, and less food. There was times where, especially in the winter '78, when screws were coming back from their mess, it was in the cache. A lot of them were coming back full, drunk. And I remember one time Paul McClinchy, because his brother Dominic and Francis Hughes and Ian Millen and a few other lads running about, IRA volunteers running about South Derry that wanted posters for them. And the screws hated Paul McClinchy because of Dominic. And Paul, some of the lads weren't taking visits. I wasn't taking visits because I was getting out after 3 years. And but Paul, he got a particularly hard time from the screws because of his brother Dominic. And this particular screw from County Down, just forget his name now, he came in this day, had been heavy snow outside, opened the door, and these snowballs were made of ice. And he thought it was a joke, big pile of them. And it hit me a couple of times, but he got into Paul McClinchy. Paul was near crying because the blanket, I want to see it, for bruises around him. So we were just talking about this word coming from the All Blacks, the beatings. It was inevitable, even though and a lot of us before when in the jail, we knew a bit of Irish history, but we started learning about a lot of history. We knew a lot of history of hunger strikes. But obviously, we all remembered Michael Cohen and Frank Stagg dying on hunger strike in 1974 and 76. So just before I got out, it was about the end of June, start of July, word was sent around all the blacks, and every lad had to get up and give their opinion on how the protest was going to escalate. Some lads in the wing were very quiet. You never heard them up the door. They didn't go up to sing, or they very rarely talked out the door. Maybe obviously talked to their cellmates, just quiet fellas. I was starting to get a bit more confidence in myself. So we all just got up. And it was very hard for me to say, even though I knew as sure as I'm sitting here, that a hunger strike was inevitable. And that's what was going to happen. So just the night before I got released, it was emotional for me. I wasn't crying about it, but it was emotional. And I was brought down to the bottom of the wing. It was an empty cell. And I got out on the 27th of July, 3 years to the day. So when I was getting in, the lads had a sing-song that night, and especially Leonard, there was Brian Gillen, Gilly, Jerry McConville, Benny Lynch, Leonard men. And we were, like every area, we're all very parochial. You had Balaki people, you had Falls Road, Ardoyne, Shore Strand, they were all parochial about their own area. It was all banter more than anything really serious. And when I got out to they brought me into a van, and the last voice I heard was Gilly shouting out in Irish, all the best or whatever case. And as soon as I got in the van, his was the last voice I heard. It was a lovely summer's day. I went down to the boards, and the day I was getting released, this governor came in and right, McCarthy, you're getting released now, you've done your time, I don't want to see you back again. And all I was thinking, I was joking at him and I'm going,
What?
So anyway, I got released from the blanket protest.
What were you thinking?
It's not all this talk.
As I walk through the Glensheen Pass, I heard a younger morn. The boy from Taladov, she cried, is 2 years dead and gone. Oh, my heart is torn apart for this brave man to lose. We'll never see the likes again of my young Francis Hughes. For many years his exploits were a thorn in old England's side. The hills and glens, they became his home. That's where he used to hide. And once when they surrounded him, he quietly slipped away, and like a fox he went to ground, and he kept the dogs at bay. Moving round the countryside, he often made the news. Oh, but they could never lay their hands on my brave Francis Hughes. But finally they wounded him and captured him at last. And from the countryside he loved, they took him to Belfast. From Musgrave Park, the crumbling road, and then to a H-block cell, he went straight on the blanket, and on hunger strike as well. His will to win they could never break, no matter what they tried. He fought them every day that he lived, and he fought them till he died. Oh, as I walked through the glen Shin Pass, I heard a young girl mourn. The boy from Taladov, she cried, is 2 years dead and gone. And oh, my heart is torn apart for this brave man to lose. We'll never see the likes again of my young Francis Hughes.
We knew we couldn't have sat there much longer, like, because it was getting to a stage where there was no other option, as far as I could see. And a lot of it was talked about from the start. Because we all know our history, we all know the thing about the Celtic Society used to go sit outside people's door to embarrass them, so that they went to arbitration and they sorted something out. We always knew that. And then we had Mick Sweeney, Thomas Ish, and then Michael Gaughan and Frank Stagg. We knew that's, and then the hunger strikes in England, the Jerry Kelly and the Price sisters and stuff. So it was always there, it was always used as a weapon. And we tried everything, we bumped everything out, we asked for this, we asked for that. Brits were just, and especially Thatcher. Well, you had Mason at the start, Roy Mason, Labour, who started that, the whole thing, taking status off us. You know what I mean? I was a political prisoner, and then I'm a criminal. And we knew, I think anybody had any sense was there, knew there was no other option but the hunger strike. And it was just a matter of who was going on it and picking the people for it.
Well, as I say, I couldn't emphasise enough about the beatings and what went on and what forced the hand into the hunger strike. As Archie says, it had been talked about in our history. So eventually, when it was decided by the Dark and by the staff, the word was sent round the wings and names were collected. And the names, as we know now from the history books, that the names that came forward was incredible. The people who were prepared to participate and to go down that road of hunger strike. And then the whole thing about the Dark and the boys. So the names had come around of the hunger strikers. The things just continued on the same in the blanket. The screws didn't change any. The beatings continued. Nothing really changed. Not like the second hunger strike, but the first hunger strike, nothing changed. They continued to beat us. One of the nights in particular, there must have been something in the food or something that day. But for near 3 weeks, the wing that I was in, because we were lucky enough, we nearly stuck together the whole way through it. The wing that I was in, must have been at least 30 men were constantly going to the toilet, constantly had diarrhea, not vomiting, just diarrhea constantly for a long, long time. And some of them occasions are like a Paddy Joe Kerr, who ended up a chief, started coming around cells. He was coming around cells, opening cells at different times of the night and letting his boys do their business again, let them beat at that time. So we had no cover whatsoever. We couldn't even go back into our cells or stay in our cells at night from 8 o'clock on. That had all gone. The game of the force boss, there's men getting pulled out on regular occasions, and force bosses, and then the systematic ones where they took us in and they done every wing. They beat the first wings, the men on the first wing they took out and hit. So you're able to look across the wing and see these people getting taken out of their cells, and you can see systematically the screws coming down, beating every one on this side. On the others, Martin came back from that day he came back from the visit. We were able to watch as Brian Armour and the rest of the boys sat upon him from the bottom cell right up. You could see his head popping up and down as they were beating him down the wings. So these things were constantly going on, and eventually the decision was taken. And as I say, it was sent around all wings and all the blocks, which after a lot of discussion, as Paddy said, between everybody had their voice one way or another, and most people did express their opinions at that time. We were very good at expressing our opinions, and it was decided that the first hunger strike would take place And as I say, the boys went on a hunger strike.
Which was geographically spread. But I think the problem was with the first one was they all went on at the same time. So they're all going to come to a crisis point at the same time. And the whole thing about who was telling who what to do, the 7 of them were going to be ill, basically.
Well, as I said, yeah, I met a few. I met Tom McAwee and
We'll talk about duties.
yeah, Tom McAwee and Michael Devine and that before it, and when the Dark, we'd met the Dark in it, and a few other prisoners who ended up on the first hunger strike. And when the first time we'd seen Bobby off that, the hunger strike, it continued on, the screws continued on with our battle in the wings, and we continued on trying to entertain ourselves, trying to keep ourselves going, because we knew it was going to come to the day that some prisoners were going to die. But the way the first hunger strike, after the first hunger strike had ended, it was the first time that the IRA was able to move freely about the H blocks. Bobby was able to move from one block to another. That was unheard of right up to the end. There was no recognition whatsoever. Well, maybe a bit with the Dark and things like that, where the governor would have come around and talked, but not to do anything. So Bobby, the night Bobby come onto our wing when the hunger strike had ended, he went in.
Bobby was OC at jail then?
He was OC at jail then. He had went in with Pat McGowan. Pat McGowan was facing us. He was later on hunger strike himself. He went into the cell with Pat and told Pat that night about the usual where the Brits had brought this document had been brought forward, and now the Brits were waltzing on it. And again, if the Brits had to give us our own clothes at that time, there would not have been a problem. There would not. If they had to give the clothes at that time, there would have not have been a problem. The 5 demands thing did not come from the prisoners inside the jail. The 5 demand thing was something that was thought up outside. The prisoners were focused on, at that time, more so
If we'd have got our own clothes,
more so on our own clothes, because we never believed for 1 minute that we'd ever get remission back, because why would the British let people like us out onto the streets again? We never believed that. So it was all geared towards that, and the 5 demands come up if they had to give us our clothes at that time. And it was shattering the people in the blocks. Although we were glad to see the boys off the hunger strike, we were glad to see the way that there had been an offer made. And then when Bobby came round and seen Pat that night, we realised that the Brits again had waltzed, and then again it started to gear up.
So they were doing that brinkmanship. It's the first time I heard that word, by the way. We're talking about brinkmanship. The Brits are very fond of it, bringing things to the edge, and then sort of confusing stuff. You know what I mean? That document, people were saying that document's coming in, that document, they'll be letting this guy die, Sean McKenna. Sean McKenna was dying, and that's put the pressure on them.
Oh, my name is John MacDonald, and from Belfast town I came. That city I will never see again. For it's in the town of Belfast that I spent many happy days. I loved my home in oh so many ways. For it's there I spent my childhood, and I found for me a wife, and I then set out to make for her a life. Oh, but all my young ambitions, they met with bitterness and with hate. I soon found myself behind their prison gates. And you dare to call me a terrorist, while you look down your gun. And when I think of all the deeds that you have done, you have plundered many nations, and you've divided many lands. You have terrorized our peoples, you rule with an iron hand, and you brought this reign of terror to my land. And through those many months of internment upon the Maidstone and on Long Kish, my thought about my land throughout those days. And why my country was divided, why I was now in jail, imprisoned without crime and without trial. And although I love my country, I am not a bitter man, and I've seen cruelty and injustice at first hand. And then one fateful morning, well, I shook both freedom's hand. For right or wrong, I tried to free my land. And you dare to call me a terrorist while you look down your gun. And when I think of all the deeds that you have done, oh, you have plundered many nations, divided many lands, and you have terrorized my people. You rule with an iron hand, and you brought this reign of terror to my land. And then one cold October's morning, I was trapped in a lion's den. I found myself in their prisons once again, and I was committed to their H-blocks for 14 years or more. And on the blanket, those conditions, they were poor. But then a hunger strike we did commence, for the dignity of man. Yet it seems to me that no one gave a damn. And I am but a saddened man, for I've watched my comrades die. There's no one really cares or wonders why. And you dare to call me a terrorist while it's you looks down the gun. And when I think of all the deeds that you have done, well, you have plundered many nations, divided many lands, and you have terrorized my family. You rule with an iron hand, and you brought this reign of terror to my land. May God shine on you, Bobby Sands, for the courage you have shown. May your glory and your name be widely known. And young Francis Hughes and Ray McCreesh, you both died unselfishly. And Patsy O'Hara, and the next in line, well, it's me. But to those who lie behind me, may your courage be the same. And I pray to God our lives have not been in vain. Oh, but sad and bitter was the year of 1981, when I think that we have lost, but it's not yet won. O'Hara, Hughes, McCreesh, Sands, Doherty and Lynch, MacDonald, Harrison, Michael Reed Devine.
After the Brits had reneged on the first hunger strike, we still
They
tried.
wouldn't show any good faith.
We still tried to talk it through. Bobby and
Matt McGovernors and
a squad of blanket men were moved onto a wing for a trial period, with actually the clothes that sent us in, the monkey suits that sent us in.
it's like American coffin care. It's like the maddest gear you ever seen in your life. No, like yellow jumpers and blue,
So even at that,
sky blue trousers.
Bobby and Emmons went into a wing to try it out, and lasted a couple of days at the most. With screws went in and done the same thing again. Took charge, started baiting prisoners. Prisoners were baiting that wing that night, and again, settled down. We realised we were still in the same position after all this, and Bobby and the blanket men again had decided to embark on another hunger strike, and that's when Bobby decided that, well, again,
And,
that
and he knew he was going
Frank
back.
was supposed
He
to
knew he
follow
was
him a
going
week
back.
after, but when Bobby was on it, they put Frank back a week because Bobby knew. But coming up to the last hunger strike, we were all pretty sure there was a great possibility of people dying. We were moved during that to H6, and that was when the election was going on, and H6 wasn't that bad for beatings or anything. But they starved us. They really starved us in H6. It was bad. They never gave us any food. It was bad. But it was bad for us. But the boys were on hunger strike, so you sucked it up, sort of thing, you know. But that was the Screws plan up there.
And he actually said when he was going on it, he said to Buck that he knew he was dying, and there was no doubt about that. But the way the first one ended, there was no way the Brits were, especially Thatcher and the Humphrey. And he said that actually got back at Mass and said, "Tell him who's replacing me." That's the way Bobby Sands was thinking. And he said he didn't want to tell him, you know, he was, and then he forced him and he says, "Who's replacing me?" He says, "Joe McDonald." And Bobby says, "Good morning, he not let me down." And that's the way I was left. And then he says he wanted to get a smoke.
But
That's it.
the last hunger strike, there wasn't really a build up to the last hunger strike. It was a build up from the start of it. It was everything after the first hunger strike. Everything else was still in place. The whole criminalisation, the normalisation, the whole policy of what they were doing, that was all still in place. So it was a matter of continuing on, then starting the hunger strike, and they say Bobby went on it. As you know, Bobby was the first.
I was in a crumb with him in '76, and see, the guy was talented. No way people talk about him. He's a blood. Everything, community, everything. You go right across for,
Their
for a
morale,
Republican.
their morale was unbelievable. The messages that Big Doc used to send down to the boys in H4, because that's where Doc was before he went to before he went to hospital. He might have been in 6 before, but before he went to hospital, and they used to send you down wee messages and tell the boys, tell such and such, tell Archie to tell the boys to keep their chin up, tell Margie Fitz to tell the boys to keep their chin up. They were always a level above you in their morale. They were
keeping our morale
They
up.
were keeping our morale up. They like at Tom McAwee. I met Tom McAwee in H3. Me and Tom were in the cell together, and it was, as I say, it was an honour to be in a cell with him. But in H3, I met him in H3, and you can go in. I went in one gate, he comes in the other gate. So I was waiting on him coming into the canteen. This is very rare. This happens between countrymen and Belfast men. I'm very proud of it. And Tom came in that time, and he literally run across the wing and threw his arms around me, because Tom was in, and a lot of thing about the hunger strikers that people don't realise there. Tom was doing life and a 14-year sentence. He appealed the sentence, which meant he was doing 7 years. The governors never took any remission of him because he was a lifer. So therefore he'd only 2 years to do. So Tom had only 2 years of a sentence. Same with Michael Devine, another absolute gentleman and a man very advanced in his politics and his socialism, a very clever man. And Michael was doing 6 years. You know, I mean, 3 years was half of his sentence. He was near out. If Michael had been one of the ones that hadn't died in a hunger strike, he'd been out a week. 2 weeks after it was all over, you know. But what basically led up to it was, again, the constant harassment, the constant beatings, the constant criminalisation was the biggest point on it. Although we talked about it ourselves personally within the jail and what we were doing, we all knew what we were doing. Outside, the British were putting it across in a different manner, that these people are criminals, that this is part, they were pushing their norm.
These men's in for murder, these men's in for bombings, these men's in for shooting, they're criminals. You had Thatcher coming out and saying a crime's a crime, a crime. No, that sort of attitude. And then you look at the likes of Raymond McCreesh in a crumb with me, and see that man, he came up to me one day with a bit of shit going on, my loyalists and screws in the wing. I'll stand behind you no matter what you're doing. And that was the type of him, and you knew he would have been there. You know what I mean?
For us in the jail and the whole thing, you know,
you can't single out any of them, they're all the same.
We're only here for a while, so you can't tell half the stories. Half the stories about Heather and Tom and Megal Devine and Joe McDonald. We knew when we were kids, and you know, you can't really go into it in a half an hour. But it was their morale, and men like them had seen that blanket through, for that to go on for such a long time, for the horrific things to take part in it. There was beatings give out, but there was bad beatings give out, How nobody ever died of them it's unbelievable.
They're expecting people to die of diseases. I was reading a thing there last night, a book, and there's a governor talking about them. This is at the end of the protest. He's talking about what the British government used them as. This governor said, we were used as cannon fodder by governments and put in the front line in the battle of criminalisation, which was always going to fail. In the end, they learned at a terrible price. You can only run a prison like Long Cash with prisoners like that with their consent, which is the whole thing about jail. They just wanted to force us to do everything, and then at the end of it, you know what happened in the end? We got everything we wanted. Who talked about criminalisation after? Who calls the Republicans criminals now? Only people here, certainly the British government don't. And to see what support we had. We always knew that support was there. Always knew it. But people were afraid of the violence. We weren't violent people, we were made violent. And the hunger strikers, and that's all they had left, their bodies. And that's what they used at the end. That was their weapon. They talk about going out with an M1 carbine, Bobby Sands. His M1 carbine was his body at the end. And he used it and he lost it.
Well, Frank made his punches, made his great speech out the door about the only thing he had left was his body. And when you think back on it and you look at him, these were bodies of men. These were 18, 19, 20-year-olds and whatever, and it had come maybe in at 12 stone, had nigh been down to 9.5 stone. I mean, there was people in our wing who weren't never on a hunger strike, but were 11, 12 stone when they come into jail. Next minute they were 9.5 stone. They were physically, mentally being abused constantly every day, and been able to take it because they were political prisoners. They weren't prepared to bend.
And then the other thing about the screws after it, going down the wings and singing, oh what a beautiful number down, oh what a beautiful morning, which is just the Brown Army used to sing every time we get down our wing.
They abused families who just died, whose fathers and mothers just died of natural causes. They were abused. We could actually talk about, you go into it for hours, the things that they come up with to torture us with. As Archie says, the legacy of it, one of the greatest legacies of it is they were unable to criminalise the struggle that has been continuing on here from 1916 onwards. And as I'm sure I've heard many a person saying, that it'll not be realised. Like 1916, like 1921, these things will not be realised until that final goal comes upon. Then we'll be able to look back on our history, and then we'll be able to see what these boys achieved. They just didn't achieve the breaking of the criminalisation. They achieved a lot more than that, in the sense that they told the world. Bobby told the world, Tom told the world, Joe told the world, Red Mark told the world that we are not criminals and we will not be criminalised.
The Corby Shanna.
Sorry, the roll of honour for Ireland's bravest men. We must be united in the memory of the 10. England, you're a monster. Oh, don't you think that you have won? We'll never be defeated while Ireland has such sons. In those dreary H-block cages, 10 brave young Irishmen lay, hungering for justice while their young lives ebbed away. For their rights as Irish soldiers and to free our native land. They stood beside their leader, the gallant Bobby Sands. Now they mourn Hughes and Balahi, brave McCreesh in Armagh's hills. Those narrow streets of free Derry, they miss O'Hara still. They so proudly gave their young lives to break Britannia's hold, and their names shall be remembered as history unfolds. Read the roll of honour for Ireland's bravest men. We must be united in memory of the 10. England, you're a monster. Don't think that you have won. We'll never be defeated while Ireland has such sons. Through the war-torn streets of Ulster, now the black flag that sadly wave to salute 10 Irish martyrs, the bravest of our brave. Joe MacDonald, Martin Herson, Gavin Lynch, Kieran Doherty. They gave their lives for freedom with Thomas McAwee. Michael Devine from Free Derry, you were the last to die. Now with your 9 brave companions and our martyr dead you lie. Your souls cry out, remember that our deaths are not in vain. So fight on and make our homeland a nation once again. Read the roll of honour for Ireland's bravest men. We must be united in the memory of the 10. Now England, you're a monster. Don't you think that you have won? We'll never be defeated while Ireland has such sons. No, we will never be defeated while Ireland has such sons.